So King's Birmingham protest began kind of quietly at the beginning of April in 1963, where he launched a series of sit-ins and pray-ins that were very much in keeping with what had gone on in Albany. Connor surprisingly reacted with very little violence. He was rather restrained. Laurie Pritchard had been brought in from Albany as a kind of consultant to school Connor in how he should conduct himself. But everything changed at the beginning of May when King made the very controversial decision to allow school children, some from high schools, middle schools, and even from elementary schools, to participate in the protests at the beginning of May. Once children were engaged, King was quickly able to fill the jails, and that left Connor incredibly frustrated. So as protesters flooded into the street, he simply didn't have more places to put them. And Connor reacted with the violence that King, in some sense, hoped would come, but that he knew would be necessary to get other constituencies interested in what was going on in Birmingham. In the middle of May '63, a very famous photo essay appeared in Life magazine. It was shot by Charles Moore, who was a Southern white photographer who was very sympathetic to the civil rights struggle. It was called "The Spectacle of Racial Turbulence in Birmingham, They Fight a Fire That Won't Go Out." It shows images of the fire department that was ordered by Connor to disperse peaceful, unarmed protesters with fire hoses, and it shows, most famously, those dog attack pictures. Life during the period had a subscription, had 19 million paid subscribers in the United States at a time when the US population was only 180 million. And it's been estimated that probably twice as many people saw Life magazine as actually had a subscription, because of course it was in barbershops and beauty parlors and dentists' offices all over the country. This was far and away the most influential publication during the period. And these pictures were actively debated, obviously, in households, but in Congress. We even have recorded conversations that tell us that President Kennedy, the day after these photos appeared, was actively talking about them in the White House, trying to assuage a liberal lobbying group that he was really doing as much as he could during the period to help African Americans. In a lot of ways, we take these photos today as being kind of self-evident. They stand as emblems of what civil rights are about. We don't need a lot of explanatory text. Even when I show photos like this to my students, they are pretty certain that they know what they're about. In the 1960s, when the photos first appeared, their meaning was in flux to some degree, and I'll explain that later. But the Life magazine provided a lot of descriptive copy to try and guide reader interpretations of what was significant about the works. And I'll read you a quote, which comes from this little caption here that's produced down on the left-hand side, because I think it's revealing for how these images are framed in the liberal white press. This is quoting, quote, "With vicious guard dogs, the police attacked the marchers and thus rewarded them with an extreme outrage that would win support all over the world for Birmingham's Negroes. If the Negroes themselves had written the script, they could hardly have asked for greater help for their cause than Connor freely gave. Ordering his men to let the white spectators come near, he said, 'I want them to see the dogs work.' And the description concludes by noting that this, quote, 'brutal scene is the attention-getting jackpot of the Negro's provocation.'" What I want to point out initially about that description that you might have noticed yourself is that it's whites in the description who fight and attack, and it's the blacks who require help or are brutalized. In the sort of imagination, at least, of Life magazine, it's the white policemen who are the active agents in this scene, who are attacking and brutalizing, and it's the African American protesters here in the street who need to be helped. You can see this also just in the title of the article, "They Fight a Fire That Won't Go Out." It's clearly the white firemen who are battling with their hoses against the so-called black fire, who are kind of cued as the active agents. They're the ones whose perspective here is being represented. And this is really a widespread way in which Birmingham activists and police are understood during this period. I read you a series of other quotes that come from almost a dozen different periodicals throughout the North that were talking again about the Birmingham protesters. The youths hit with firemen's hoses were talked about as flattened, sent sprawling, spun head over heels, sitting passively, swept along the gutter by a stream of water, cut down like 10 pins, or flung into the air like sodden dolls, some with their clothing ripped off. A white Birmingham native who was there witnessing the scene talked about the fact that Connor's fire hoses, quote, sent black arms and legs jerking like those of puppets on a string, and bodies cartwheeling across the grass like scraps of paper caught in the wind. The consistent description of passive traits, of inactive traits to the black protester in Birmingham was a dominant way in which the white liberal media reported. Consistently, whites were active, even though they were active they were active in actually changing America for the better, as I'll make the argument in a second, even though they were actively trying to stop it. And these kinds of reports were not merely confined to the press during the period, but were consistently ones that liberal white Americans understood to be operative. In meeting with civil rights leaders just a couple of days after these pictures were taken, President Kennedy commented to an assembled group that, quote, Bull Connor has done more for civil rights than virtually anyone else. The liberal reporter David Haberstam, who was incredibly sympathetic to the civil rights struggle, wrote in 1967, quote, in retrospect, it was not so much Martin Luther King who made the movement go, it was Bull Connor. Each time a bomb went off, a head smashed open, the contributions would mount at King's headquarters. This notion of blacks being passive and whites being active is one that I actually make a claim as a kind of gatekeeper for an image's eligibility for inclusion in the civil rights drama. And why do I say that? Well, these photos you recognize as iconic, of course. Think of the other photos from the period that we think of as being significant, as being the ones that stand out, as the ones that represent what the 60s are about. Elizabeth Eckford in Little Rock, when she's integrating a previously all-white school, she's famous for being this sort of stoic young girl, though looks like a woman. She's 15 years old at the time, who's walking away from protesters whose faces are kind of contorted with rage, who are acting on her. We can think of the many scenes of sit-ins throughout the South, beginning after the first in 1960, that show, again, stoic, sometimes interracial white and black protesters who are weathering the abuse, having ketchup, salt, pepper, coffee, cigarette butts put out on them by these crowds that surround them and are often taunting them. We can think also of the Freedom Riders, who are sitting around their bombed, fire-burning bus near Anniston. They're sort of dazed around the bus as we see the bus being engulfed in flames. And then we can think again of John Lewis at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, who's being beaten there in the foreground. The images that are most famous, the ones that are most iconic today, the ones that are most seared into our memory, consistently have this blacks as passive. And I want to make clear, I'm not making an argument at all that the black activists were in any way passive. I'm saying that for liberal whites to sympathize with the plight of African Americans during the period, they needed to see them as passive. They needed to see them as a group that needed to be helped, and they needed to see white people as being in a position of needing to magnanimously intervene and actually improve the lot of African Americans. That was consistently what was important. The first Pulitzer Prize winning photograph of civil rights from 1966 shows James Meredith being shot during his March Against Fear. So this is the first civil rights image that received a Pulitzer Prize, and it's again showing in some ways a man at his most helpless. Not the agency it took to engage in this march through dangerous southern white territory, not the stamina he required when he was being abused by people alongside the road each day, but the moment when he's wounding and screaming and crawling in pain to seek medical assistance. That's what receives the Pulitzer Prize.